Good afternoon, and welcome to the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative webinar, Future of Education, Equity, Inclusion, and Racial Justice, with Chief Advisor to the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative, Dr. Christine Mason, and our panelists, Dr. Yvette Jackson, Dr. Rachel Santa, and Ann Smith. My name is Dana Asby, and I will be your webinar manager and host. Today's meeting will last approximately 1 hour and 30 minutes. Microphones will be muted during the presentation. At designated times, for example, during our question and answer session, you can use the raise your hand feature to request an open mic. When speaking, please be sure to eliminate background noise. Thanks to a partnership with C4 Innovations, we are offering 1 hour of continuing education credit for participation in this webinar. We can also offer you a certificate of participation. Instructions for both of these will be included in the slideshow, which will be emailed to you at the close of today's event, 24 hours after the close of today's event. For record-keeping purposes, please identify yourself while on the meeting platform using the first and last name or email address you use to register for this event. You can either ensure your name appears as part of your video panel or enter it in the chat box. Registration affirms your consent to receive an evaluation follow-up link via email and your consent to recording. If you experience any technical issues, please send a private chat message to Ingrid Paget, our technical support manager for today's webinar. We're pleased you joined the webinar, and I'd now like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Dr. Christine Mason, an educational psychologist and CEI's, before I introduce Dr. Mason, let me just remind you that we use person-first language on this webinar, so please do be mindful of using positive, strengths-based, and person-first language in the chat and during Q&A sessions. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Christine Mason, an educational psychologist and Center for Educational Improvement's founder and executive director, as well as the chief advisor to the New England MHTTC's Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative. Dr. Mason is a nationally recognized expert in the area of educational reform, mindfulness, teacher mentoring, and special education. Dr. Mason is joined today by Dr. Yvette Jackson, Senior Scholar for the National Urban Alliance. Dr. Jackson is internationally recognized for her work in assessing the learning potential of disenfranchised urban students. Also joining us is Dr. Rachel Santa, Director of Special Services for Cumberland School Department in Cumberland, Rhode Island, and a Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative Fellow. Dr. Santa uses her background as a music therapist and special educator to develop systems of support to meet the academic, functional, and emotional needs of students. We are also pleased to have Ann Smith with us today. Ms. Smith is the Executive Director of the African Caribbean American Parents of Children with Disabilities, commonly known as AFCAMP, Advocacy for Children. AFCAMP provides resources, training, and advocacy and promotes family and youth voice to improve outcomes for children and families. And now I'd like to pass it over to our host, Dr. Christine Mason.
Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to be with you today and to be with my distinguished panelists. And as we go forward, can you advance to the next slide, please? You know, we've been through a really tough time. We're still in the midst of one. And during this time of COVID, we've also been experiencing the trauma of systemic racism. Even as we've seen widespread support for people of all races, and particularly for Black lives and Black Lives Matter, we know that it's been a difficult time as well. And this is a time where, in fact, the New England Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative is focused on justice, equity, and fairness. We really hope that as we end this phase and go forward into the future, that in fact, justice, equity, and fairness will improve and the lives of everyone will be improved. What are some of the things we've learned since March 2020? What are we learning? What's working? What remains to be handled? And just as important as these questions is the question is, what are we to learn? You know, what's this all about? Is there a message here for what we could be doing differently as a planet? Think about equities, the importance of connecting. And what we know is that during this time of physical distancing, that connecting over the internet becomes really important. If you're like me, you'll find that there are times when you turn on the internet and you see a friend or colleague, and you just kind of say, wow, I'm so glad we're connecting. So glad that we have this opportunity to be with each other. We also know that this has been a time of coping with grief and loss, and that some people are more impacted than others. When we think about equity and inclusion and remote learning, we know that there are some students, some children who've been better supported than others, some families that are better resourced, they're better able to cope, and others who have really struggled. And I can remember many times over the last few months where we've talked to the fellows and others in New England, and we've heard great concern because our educators have had difficulties finding some children, reaching them, being with them. We also know that it's been a time where we've had a lot of difficulty figuring out what's an appropriate accommodation that's safe to deliver. What can we do so that if students are struggling with their learning, that we provide the additional supports that may be part of an IEP, or supports that may just be good basic procedures that most students or many students will need to improve their learning. So there's this body of work that we've been doing on visioning and visioning for the future. And we're basing a lot of what we're doing today on that body of work. Our goals today are first to understand the value of visioning for an inclusive and equitable future. Let me just say with this, sometimes we think about planning. We've got a plan for the future. We've got school districts who are engaged in planning, principals, teachers engaged in planning. We believe it's one thing to plan, it's another thing to be very strategic in our visioning. And we hope to take you through some activities today and to share with you some information that will help you get beyond just thinking about or planning for next week or tomorrow, but really thinking about a vision for the future. Our second goal is to learn about the needs and best and promising practices for achieving equity, ensuring inclusion, and advocating for children and youth. Peter Senge is one of the people we follow closely. And you know what he says? He says, learning is driven by vision. So we believe our vision for equity and inclusion and advocacy is critical. And we hope that by the end of today, you too will have some new tools to help you through this period that's coming, the period that we're in right now. I just want to say too, that as we talk, feel free to use the chat line if you have comments or questions for us. So our process for visioning includes 8 steps. It's an iterative process. We believe that you can't adequately vision in 30 minutes or 2 hours. It takes a period of months, some time of reflection, going back and forth, thinking about what we call micro elements, the things that might be like, what are we doing with higher order thinking? Or what are we doing with virtual reality? And also macro elements, thinking about our global planet and what we could do to end up with better equity for people around the globe. What are some of the big, broad visions we have? We believe that both of these components, the micro and the macro, are an important part of looking at a vision, researching to find out what others are doing, looking for exemplars, and going back. As we vision, and as you listen to us today, we'd like you to think about your ideal vision. What is it you dream about? What do you really want to have happen? What's practical? How can we be ensured that it's inclusive? Where do we have the flexibility? Where are we going to say we're not quite sure, but we're going to explore? But how can we be bold? Because if we're not bold, if we just take those small steps all the time, sometimes the great accomplishments don't occur. So be bold. And how can you do it in a way that shows compassion and empathy for yourself and others? So let's think about equity and some of our aims. What are we going to do to replace punitive consequences? Are we turning towards restorative justice? Are we working towards building healthy relationships, empowering youth? And what's our schools doing with their policies? Are they getting rid of zero tolerance policies and improving equity and academic performance? We know too that inequity shows in many, many ways. It may be in terms of finances and the capital that is expended in various areas, various schools. We know that certain schools are woefully underfunded and that there's a widening gap, and that during COVID, we have seen this in many, many ways. And a lot of them are related to racial lines. So we have aims for equity that must be addressed. So here's a question for you. What are your two top concerns right now? And you can read them: accessibility of supports, family engagement, etc. Just go through the list and identify two. It's pretty clear that one of the biggest needs is to get adequate supports for students who need them. And it's a really difficult thing to do, particularly when we think that often these supports are given by sitting beside a student, being there in person and helping with the interpretation of the material that's presented, or making those accommodations kind of on the spot as you see that a student's not responding or is having difficulty figuring out what to do. And of course, if all your interaction is through the net, it's really hard sometimes to know who's getting it and who is struggling. So giving those accommodations is a huge need. Other needs that look to be large for what you have here is student fear and anxiety, the grief and loss. And what do? How do we provide those emotional supports? A lot of them we know that we've provided by physically being next to someone, smiling, helping them just to feel our presence and be comforted by our presence. What do we do when that main interaction is either online or perhaps occurring sporadically? Someone comes to school for 2 days a week and then they're off on their own. Or we have schools that are operating a hybrid model and then they're shut down because of COVID and they're back to being at home and isolated. Huge concerns. Also, teacher and staff self-care. We realize that self-care is really critical. And what we like to say is that it's important to take care of yourself. It's really hard to take care of others if you're not taking care of yourself. So, Yvette, I believe these questions lead us to your part of the presentation.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so I'm just going to push down the polls. Okay, so first of all, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. And Chris, thank you for setting up this process, not only in terms of the actual event, but the questions, the poll that you put forward. So Chris was talking about a major goal of ours, obviously, is looking at equity. And so a consideration for us today in terms of my part of this session is going to be, what are we even really talking about in terms of equity? How should we define it? We have bullet points about it, but what does it look like? So here are some key questions that I'd like you to be considering as I go through this presentation. And think about it in terms of not just equity, but the term equity consciousness. And that's the key here, consciousness. So let's look at three of these questions, or all three of the questions, I should say. What causes the most repercussive barriers to high levels of learning and equity? What do you think the biggest barrier is? Second is, what is the most informative element in actualizing equity consciousness? What does it really take to get a school district to be equity conscious? And the last one is, what is the ideology that offers the vision of what equity-driven pedagogy should be? Those are our questions, our advanced organizers. So I want to start with the idea of equity, because I work in a lot of school districts around this country, and people can give me policy definitions of equity, like removing predictability, like interrupting inequitable practices. but that doesn't tell me what it looks like in the classroom. So when I ask what is it in the classroom that's going to prove to me that there's really an equity consciousness going on, people have a really hard time coming up with that idea. And I have to tell you, I've studied, my background is actually in gifted education. And what I found out about gifted education in terms of definition is what to me really equity consciousness is. For instance, look at this. The idea of gifted education in terms of how it was defined by the federal government was to engage students to draw out their potential. And in fact, when we think about it though, education has its Latin derivative in the word or the stem educo, and that actually means to draw out potential. So gifted education has been drawing out the potential for those who are labeled as gifted to identify their strengths and high intellectual performances. That's what the HIP stands for. But the question I have back to you that gets us to equity consciousness is, why isn't that for everyone? So if I took away the label and just say educate all of our students in an equitable fashion, that really would be how people define gifted education. And I am saying that is what equity consciousness is about. And when you're drawing out potential, you choose those kind of practices that are going to enable our students to thrive and flourish, not just to get higher math or reading scores, not just to survive academically, but to leave schools in such a way that they feel a sense of value, they feel a sense of agency, of investment. And so, why do I think that this is so critically important, this idea of gifting all of our students as a way of defining equity consciousness? Let's look at it from a neurological basis, or the neuroscience of education. So let's look at the propensity of the brain, what we've learned from neuroscience. So I have some data points here that I'd like you to think about, reflect on. What do you think 86 to 100 billion stands for? I'm going to just give you a second to just think about that. If you want to chat in real fast, you could do that as well. What do you think 86 to 100 billion is? You probably have some answers coming in, but I will tell you that that is the number of neurons estimated, theoretically estimated in the brain. Now, I say theoretically because even though we have found out a lot through MRIs and different kinds of testing, the brain still has so much that we have not discovered. But so far, we say 86 to 100 billion neurons in the brain. That is a lot of neurons that allows very strong propensity in terms of intellectual development. What do you think 10 to 15% stands for? Try to give us a chat in on that one. All right. That is actually what is theorized as the capacity of intellectual ability that anyone uses. Now, again, it's a theory, but what we're saying is that there is so much more that all of us could use in terms of, or demonstrate in terms of our intellectual capacity that we're not seeing. So what do you think 30 to 45% is? Another chat time. So basically what that is the amount or the intellectual capacity that is inherited. That's inherited. So think about this, because people used to think that intelligence was fixed and all of our capacity intellectually was actually inherited, but that's not true. What we know is that only 30 to 45 is intellectually or inherited, and the rest of our capacity, what does that mean? What's the implication? That it's what students have been exposed to, how they are supported, what they are feeling that they have deep interest in. That is exactly what most of our intelligence is capable of being built upon. Next. That's where the 70% comes in. So what we're saying is that so much of the ability of all of our students is based on us and what we're providing. And that is why my work is called a pedagogy of confidence. And that, to me, the idea of pedagogy, the art and science of teaching what's going on in the classroom, is literally the vehicle for equity consciousness. It's not a policy. You can have great policies that are sitting in an office, and maybe you even see some of those policies come into fruition, but it is the pedagogy in the classroom. And that's why I'm using this metaphor of educating the gifted or gifted education. Because if I say to you, well, what do you look for when we're educating students labeled as gifted? You'll say project-based learning, you'll say interest, you'll say a lot of exposure, you'll say a lot of other kinds of experiences that push them to the frontier of their intelligence. And what we're really saying here is that that is what we should be looking for and putting in place when we're led by an equity consciousness. So we're talking about gifting all students for high intellectual performances, self-actualization, and the ability to make a contribution. That is the equity consciousness. So when we say that, we're getting to this idea of transcendence, having students to be able to reflect on their own capacity for innate gifts and strengths, and then to be able to use them to make a contribution to the world. That's the idea of self-transcendence. So again, when you think about equity consciousness, yes, there are barriers that we need to get over, but if we are focused on their potential, if we take away the outside color of skin and say we're going to focus on gray matter, then those barriers actually have to dissipate, and we can distinguish what should become impermissible and what is greatly needed for activating that intellectual capacity. Next slide. And so one of the things we know for sure from gifted education that should be part of our equity consciousness, that should lead it, first of all, is the idea of identifying student strengths. The second thing is being able to connect to the cultural framework or frame of all students. In other words, if we look at it, it is exactly that it is culture that affects how we make meaning, our cognition, how we think, and language kind of acts as a medium for that kind of a communication between the culture and how we are making meaning. Now, I'm not just the person who came up with this idea. Actually, Lev Vygotsky, as you can see from the quote here, is the one who first started talking about the importance of connecting to culture for building up how a person is making meaning and understand the world. So I'll just read that. It says, language and culture are the frameworks through which humans experience, communicate, and understand reality. So in this idea of equity consciousness, in our classrooms, besides identifying strengths, literally what students are capable of, we start connecting to what are those things that are most meaningful and relevant to them. So remember, culture is not race, but how people look at race, especially in this country, is very cultural. But that is not what I am talking about, the culture. How do we draw out from those students, from our students, those things that are most relevant and meaningful to them, so we can use those ideas to connect to the learning process. Next slide. So now I want to give you the other side of the cultural frame of reference. I was just talking about all those positive things, the experiences, the people, the places that affect how we make meaning in the world. And yet for students of color, there's another side of that cultural frame of reference. And that is not only how they see the world, meaning their frame, how they look at it, but how they think the world sees them. What do I mean by that? Think about the kind of terminology that is used in school to describe students of color. Things like minority or the term subgroup. What do both of those indicate? Less than. And the more an individual has to use those kinds of terms to describe themselves, then they literally become otherized and feel marginalized and feel that they do not belong. And so when you go back and you think about the language that is used in school, don't think, and I shouldn't just say school, obviously when we talk about minorities, that's a term that the federal government came up with that continues to make us, me as a person of color, to feel I will never belong to the mainstream. And we cannot have that. In an equity consciousness, that becomes invalid. It is impermissible. Or the term subgroup, we can say students of color. Okay, but it's not just in terms of racial designation. What about students with disabilities? Why is it called disabilities? We understand that that has helped us to identify needs. But what I'm saying is students who have different variable learning needs are not disabled from doing everything. So how we use language is really, really critical. Next slide. So when you think about this idea of how students of color think the world sees them and feeling a sense then of not belonging, a critical element in the work of equity consciousness is this idea of creating communities of belonging. That means that the kinds of rituals, the kind of activities, the kind of practices are put into place that first of all, help students feel that they can affiliate, that they belong, that their identity is part of the identity of the others in the room. So in other words, we look at driving out or eliciting from kids those kinds of things that I said earlier are meaningful and relevant to them and affect how they see the world, their frame. And when we have students identify that across the spectrum, meaning with others, even with their teachers, what they find out, what we find out is we have a lot of commonalities. So when you're looking at equity work, you don't start by saying we're going to look at diversity as our main focus. No, we're going to look at affiliation, because these students feel or need to feel that they belong. So the more that the commonalities are brought out, or the human universalities, like family, like those things that are important and meaningful in terms of education, religion, those are the things that probably we all would write down as meaningful and relevant. That's what we would put in our cultural frames of reference that we all share. We can bond around, we can communicate around, we can make those connections. In a community of belonging, students feel a sense of value. That means we start the beginning of the year, and it's not too late, even though this is November, in identifying student strengths or having them identifying their strengths and then making those strengths the connectors to how we get into a particular area of study. See, because if you start the year by identifying student strengths, you have the belief in their capacity, and that becomes really critical, but it also makes students feel, yes, I am so capable. Their self-esteem shoots up, and that means their engagement is deepened. Their perspectives are so critical in a community of belonging, how we look at those perspectives and use those perspectives with honor, or having students share their experiences that we then connect to the content that we're trying to teach. In a community of belonging, we also look at developing agency in students, meaning giving them voice, giving them control over what happens in terms of not only the activities that are going on in a classroom, but actually in the content that the teachers are covering, giving students more opportunity for decision-making. The last part of this community of belonging is investment. How we get students so engaged that they believe their class is not only theirs in terms of affiliation, but making it the best class possible, giving them involvement and ownership, say in what happens in the school, even the discipline protocols. How come students can't be given that kind of task? And so in the work, in terms of translating the community of belonging into pedagogical practices, I have identified 7 high operational practices, the first 4 of which actually came from gifted land, meaning, again, back to that metaphor of what you give students when you acknowledge their innate capacity. You identify and activate their strengths. You build relationships. And yes, that goes throughout all kinds of education, but it's not only the social, emotional relationships, but how does their world relate to what is being taught? That's building relationships, eliciting high intellectual performances, not just literacy. The idea of providing enrichment. So many schools, when I look at their school improvement plans, they only talk about enrichment for students who they have labeled as gifted. And we know that enrichment actually opens the frame of references of students, so there's more that they can connect to as they're in the learning process, and for developing more interest and strengths. The idea of integrating prerequisites. You know, in early childhood, we talk about readiness, but before you teach any new unit of study, how do you get the students ready with new enrichment, with new exposure, so that they in fact can go into the unit with a sense of strength? The last two, situating learning in the lives of students. How do you take your content, look for the big concepts, and then help students make connections between those concepts and their personal lives? The only way to help them do that is by them telling you. How they can get into your head and share with you becomes pivotal. And the last is amplifying their voice. I don't just mean on a survey. I mean, why can't they be part of different kinds of committees in schools? Why can't they be, as I said earlier, writing and being involved in discipline codes, or the kinds of activities that they feel the schools should integrate to actually help them feel more engaged? And there is where we'll now flow into the next part of this. And I'm hoping that what you took away from that is the idea of looking at equity in terms of gifting all students. Thanks, Chris.
So, Yvette, I want to just focus for a minute on a couple of the ideas you presented. I'm thinking about student voice and student strengths.
Mhm.
And I really believe that these are critical for us to know about these during this time.
Right.
What do we do when our main interaction is over the internet? How can we identify student strengths and really make sure we pay attention to student voice?
Oh, well, in terms of identifying student strengths, the first thing you can do is ask them what they're strong at. You know, often we do not ask the students themselves. Now, I have to warn you though, in some situations where students have never been asked what their strengths are, they will have no answer for you, only because one, they've never been asked, so they haven't reflected, or two, they've been otherized so much that they don't feel that they have strengths. So then sometimes, Chris, what I do is, instead of say, what are your strengths? I say, what are you deeply interested in? What are you passionate about? Because usually it's that passion that's going to turn into a strength. So what do I do with it though? I take the ideas that they bring forward in terms of their strengths, and as we're working on any new unit of study, what I'm preparing them for is to look at how they could use their strengths in any kind of connection for a project-based learning around that concept that could push them into more deeply learning that content, but from the perspective of what they feel they're very passionate about and what their strengths are in. In terms of student voice, we have students literally participating in staff meetings with teachers virtually, because we can do this virtually now, have students participating in those staff meetings where they're sharing their ideas in terms of what they feel would be really important for them, where we have students surveying, doing surveys. Again, these are things students can do online, surveying their other students about that kind of information as well, what they think is important, or what's happening in their community, or what's happening in the world that they'd like to make more connections to. So it's the idea of including them in actual authentic conversations, discourses, and opportunities to make those connections between what has to be learned and what's important to them.
Yvette, thank you. I want to just turn to one of our other panelists. Anne, are you available? Okay, so,
I am, Chris.
okay, so the question for you is, if we think about equity consciousness, and I love that concept of consciousness, being fully aware.
Right.
And if we go back to John Kabat-Zinn, we would even
Right.
say being mindful, fully aware without judgment.
That's
in the
right.
moment. And if you think about parents and families and the whole advocacy program that you run, how has equity consciousness helped families during this time period? Or how could it help families during this time period?
So thank you for that question. And I thank also Yvette for the insights that she shared with us in her presentation. And so I would offer that it's not only at this time that we need to be very much focused on including the amplified voices of our parents, our families, caregivers, as well as students. Because when we look at the education experience, there are many different perspectives to that are beyond what happens in the classroom. And I believe also that we need to really do more. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing now as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how we have had to move education as we know it into a virtual sphere, which I have to honestly say serves some students better than it does other students, and which is easier for some families to engage in and support than it is for others, for many systemic reasons. And so I believe that it is really an opportunity for us to take a real close look at what we need to do to change systems that are perpetuating inequitable outcomes so that they can begin to promote.
Thank you. And I think, Anne, you bring up a really, really good point, that we have to focus some on systems. You know, there's some things we do at an individual level, a community level, but a lot of what needs to change are policies and systems, ways of interacting, ways of thinking about all of us, so that we can recognize everyone, where the needs are, and we can allocate resources in a way that's more fair and more just. Let's move on. Rachel, I believe you're next. Oh, there's a question first. I think the question actually relates to Rachel's. Can you? Oh,
no, we're actually going to move that down a little bit, Chris. Thank you, Chris.
Okay.
Just to piggyback on your conversation around systems and Anne's comments based on Yvette's comments, is you're absolutely right. School districts are completely forced to put kids into subgroups in order to obtain funding. So you're required to label under IDEA. You're required to report on our sub-pops. I'm not saying I like that term, but that is what it's called, regarding free and reduced lunch. I have to tell you, my whole career, I never understood, why are we making decisions regarding free and reduced lunch? That doesn't make a lot of sense. But in order to obtain certain funding, school systems do rely on that. So my portion is really discussing more about school-based services and working with students with disabilities. I'm sure many of you know that both the federal and our state regulations, at least in Rhode Island, required us to continue to provide free and appropriate public education to all students. So there was no changes regarding timelines or how services were to be provided during the COVID and distance learning, essentially. We still have to provide evaluations to determine eligibility. We have to still give the exact same access as we would a typical student. And as many of our students, this particular population of students is at high risk to have regressed during COVID pandemic. We know our students often regress over the summer, like many students do. All students regress a little bit, but our students with special needs have a higher propensity to regress. And then with that large period of time of a different structure, where there is a significant concern regarding regression of skills. It's not all bad. There are some students that actually did benefit from distance learning, especially those who have more trouble with their social skills. One way that we address this in the district I work for, which is the Cumberland School Department in Rhode Island, is from the very, very beginning, from that early March. I think our last day of in school was Friday the 13th, March 13th. We had a week off, and then we started distance learning. Our special educators provided individual distance learning plans. We made that up, which essentially delineated for the families and the student how the services would be provided in a distance learning environment. So our teachers pulled those together with sometimes within just a couple of days, and delineated these with our families to have a discussion regarding how those services would be provided, what would look like in this new environment. I'm really pleased that we thought to do that because I feel like it avoided a lot of miscommunication in chaos that was occurring. Next slide, please. Anyone who has worked with me or talked to me, I always talk about all students. I'm not just about a special ed student agenda. I believe that our students who are more vulnerable are canaries in the coal mine. They're the ones that are telling us when there's a big issue within our regular ed environment. They're the ones that tell us that there's a tier 1 instructional issue. They're the ones that pipe up. So when I think about strategies, I always think about what are the strategies to educate all students. So there was a recent meta-analysis of 114 different studies that implemented flipped classrooms. And this is really before COVID, but it really does apply to distance learning. And they recommended a very specific approach of how we could address distance learning for the majority of students. I'm not talking about every kid, but the majority of kids. That we provide an asynchronous instruction, that we use videos, textbooks, recorded lessons, any of those type of materials ahead of time. And then prior to synchronous instruction, when we're actually working with that student, they complete a practice task, an exit ticket, a formative assessment, some little bit of a dipstick tool so that we understand where they're at. Then in synchronous, we would review and complete the teacher would then review and complete an error analysis of that exit ticket, formative assessment, dipstick assessment, whatever way you want to call that. Synchronized instruction really needs to be either if it's online or in person, because many of our schools are hybrid, some of them are all distance learning, whatever way it is. When there's synchronous instruction, it really begins with reteaching of those areas of misunderstanding. So this is really just very good teaching practices, but really important in this distance learning environment. So we reteach those areas of misunderstanding, we review it, go over common understanding, and move on. And the majority of our synchronous teaching is spent on students interacting with each other to complete higher level cognitive thinking skills. We really need them working together. I think for a variety of not just social and emotional support, but also the interaction and the synthesis that comes about when you're talking, very much like what we're doing today. We bounce off each other and think about all our ideas and move them forward. And that's really important for students. It's what they're missing and craving when they're sitting at home alone, at least the majority of kids. The most effective use of synchronous instructional time is providing small group and individual support, as well as questioning and discussion opportunities. That's been determined to be the most effective piece, and that we need to provide students with specific feedback and action steps on their work. So this is exactly what's going on, and this is what you need to do to fix it or to work with it or work with me together. I think the Google Suite has been really helpful in my world in that we can give on-demand, in real-time feedback on kids' writing and things along those lines. And prior to distance learning, especially at my middle school and high school level, I often had teachers sitting in their classroom, but they were giving feedback to the student in the actual regular ed classroom, giving feedback on their writing or giving them cues. Oh, don't forget, you're supposed to be doing this now. Or even once in a while, a focusing cue. Are you paying attention? Are you looking at the teacher? Are you nodding with your understanding? Things along those lines. So then if we're also talking about additional strategies to educate students with disabilities, then there's a couple things that we will recommend or think about. In an informal survey, we determined that really the key aspect to whether students were being successful in distance learning or not was really whether or not they had small group and individual instruction. they need to have, we know they need to have academic foundational instruction 3 to 5 times a week. They need to have interventions that jointly target both academic and emotional needs. There's a recent study that just came out that talked about, and I don't think this is going to be any surprise to anybody, that if you pair a 5-minute strategy of decreasing anxiety before you're teaching a student that has a disability, let's say a reading disability, a systematic reading intervention, that if you pair those up, that their reading scores increase faster because they're learning how to approach a topic or a task that they're nervous about, is not their best skill, is hard for them. And we're giving them those strategies to calm down first and then get the instruction. We all know that if you have a high level of anxiety, you can't be learning, that's all you're thinking about is the anxiety. I think of that as cups of tea on your shoulders. If those are full of anxiety and at any minute they're gonna tip out, you can't be paying attention to the learning. So we work on that. And then really adapting strategies such as check in, check out, providing immediate feedback, and social coaching in that distance world. And as always, especially in the special ed world, we need to regularly collect data, review, and use those results to inform instruction. Okay. The next thing is, this is a poll we'd like you to take. And the question is, what do you think was the greatest factor that allowed students to transition well to distance learning versus those who didn't? So the options are, do you think it was their connection to their teachers, the independence of the student, working technology and Wi-Fi, or school leadership? Seems to me that there might be one missing. And when one of those things are missing is maybe the engagement of the family or parent. Okay, so connection, making that personal connection was the highest result, with second only to working technology and Wi-Fi. Of course, distance learning without technology and Wi-Fi, forget it, right? It's not gonna work. And we've all struggled with Zoom meetings that don't quite work. I went through a whole time where all of a sudden my webcam and microphone didn't work in my mind, for absolutely no reason. We also know that connection to the teacher is important. In an informal survey that was done that I did with my folks, they identified that parent engagement and support was the key aspect. I didn't give them, it was an open-ended question. I didn't give any choices like we just did in the poll. It was very open-ended, and my folks, almost every single teacher identified that the amount of parent engagement. So let's talk about that. The next slide. So one after that, yep. So what we have to realize that parents are not teachers. They are teachers in some ways regarding how do you live in your house and doing your chores and things on those lines, but they're not really designed to do the individual instruction or to do the classroom instruction. And to put that role on them is incredibly stressful. And I'm sure that many of you have worked with families that are discussing this, but I don't know, I'm not the teacher, you be the teacher, or things along those lines. So what can parents do? Well, what we can ask parents to do is to have kids ready for school on time, just like a typical school year, to provide a structured location where they can work on their assignments. Just recently in a meeting I was in this past week, we also talked about, well, can they have one spot where they're doing their work and a whole nother spot where they can play the Xbox, so that those areas are very distinct, because this kid is playing the Xbox all day and he's not doing his work. So can we have different environments for things along those lines? And we need to be able to access, we need to have the ability to access someone to help them troubleshoot technology issues, and who that liaison for technology is going to be. And then as educators, we need to make sure that we have a district liaison for technology. To be very open and front, Cumberland is the least funded district in the entire state. In other words, our pupil expenditure is the least amount. So any ideas I'm giving you has nothing to do with money. But what we did do is redistribute someone. We redistributed a clerk, I think that was typically working in the library or something on those lines, and doing probably a couple different jobs joining my district. And we assigned them just to look at the technology tickets that were coming in, because they were coming in so fast that my overwhelmed IT department, which they're overwhelmed typically, just could not handle it. So she manages it. She has 3 screens in front of her, and she's managing those IT tickets as they come in and troubleshooting with families, helping them to swap out machines if she needs to, and just really organizing what needs to happen. I highly recommend that. So we assigned a district liaison. And we need to make sure that we are purchasing and being thoughtful in what we provide of high quality materials that can be easily adapted to both online and in-person instruction. Up to now, Cumberland has really been making sure that, including it being a policy, that any new curriculum that purchased it had a tier 2 intervention that was part of it, that it wasn't a separate entire program, but these were combined programs. Now, in conjunction with that, we need to look at, is there an online and in-person? What does that look like? Are there things that can smoothly go back and forth between both environments? So I call this Rachel's realizations. I didn't know what else to call it, but these are some things that I've thought about, and some very recently. And I know there's some folks from my district who are in this meet, and I will tell you that some of these thoughts have not been communicated with everybody yet. So that's a little caveat. But one of the key pieces is we have to really be careful that we're providing technology that meets the communication skills, the self-regulation, and the physical capabilities of the student. And in some cases, you have to abandon the technology and send home packets. And I know that I have folks that are delivering packets to homes and things along those lines because the kids cannot handle the level of technology, or they don't have the physical capabilities, even with modified equipment, or they don't have the focusing to pay attention to the screen. We need to review how dependent students are on prompts. We want to increase independence. I think we've always talked about this in meetings. I know I personally have emphasized, why don't, instead of the teacher prompting, especially as they get upwards into the upper elementary, middle, why don't we use a checklist instead of constantly us prompting them in order to build independence? Well, one thing that we identified is, gosh, once those kids went to distance learning, their independence level was really obvious. Those students who are completely prompt dependent, those students that rely on an adult to constantly tell them what to do from moment to moment. So that is something that's happened, but there's positives to that, which is now figuring out strategies to help them to build their independence, which can only be beneficial as they get older. We need to make sure we're providing families with take-home materials such as workbooks, packets, reading books, arts and craft materials. Small whiteboards has been a huge thing that our families have really appreciated and our students are using in distance learning, as well as occupational therapy materials such as putty and beads, their own little personal bag of manipulatives that they can use, and also checklists and things on those lines to help them organize their work. My district is not doing any meetings. We're not allowing people into our buildings to do meetings. We are using Google Meets and Zoom for team meetings, and I will tell you, high positiveness with this. I don't know if that's a word. High level of engagement. We're getting more parents involved, less cancellations. We've had people able to do it easier on their lunch break. I've had meetings where parents are in their car, not driving, but in their cars, like taking a break. And I feel like we've had better parental engagement, and we've had better engagement of our regular educators. They're able to jump in a little bit quicker. When there is in-person learning, we are having to figure out subs to cover teachers so they can participate, which is a little bit of a challenge, a big challenge, I should say. However, I do see that the use of Google Meets is going to be a common continuation after distance learning. We had been using phone calls but this is even better because you can read people's body language. You really want to consider how many emails and texts are being sent home and to consolidate what is most important. If you're part of Google Classroom, you're getting lots, and our parents don't know what's important, what's not important. It's getting lost in the shuffle. I think we've all had that experience where you've gotten so many emails that after a while you're like, you didn't really pay attention to that school email, or you're not paying attention to the Google Classroom email. And of course, it's that one that's really important, right? So really thinking about systems of how to consolidate that, decrease it, things like that. You might want to consider the permanent use of distance learning strategies for students who are anxious avoiders, are home or housebound or hospital bound. So we do have students, unfortunately, that are hospitalized or homebound, and we're finding some of the strategies for distance learning are very effective. We've also had a couple cases of students who are selectively mute, who we've actually been able to engage a little bit more when the anxiety of not being around other people has decreased and they just have the square on the page, the Brady Bunch square, right? So we can consider the use of that. And I say the word consider. I'm not saying do all these things. I'm saying think about what are some things that we can do in the future. Also utilizing online programs for individual pacing and progress monitoring. My high school uses and middle school uses Edgenuity, which is an online platform for standard-based education where you can take an entire course on it. We've used it within our special ed world in the past and continue to with our students that can't handle the pacing of a typical classroom. They're more than capable of the content, but the pacing is too hard, too fast. With using something like Edgenuity or Play-Doh, there's a lot of these type of programs out there. They're able to stop the instructor, take a break, rewind it, listen to it again, listen to the lesson again, still get support from our teachers, but they're seeing that lesson in the way it was meant to be presented in at their pace, and it's been fantastic. So we've used that for several years, and I think you can continue to expand in looking at that for students who need that individual pacing and progress monitoring. All right, so here's a big one. I have two big ones. One's on the list, one's not. One of these things I think we should consider is elimination of the current model of co-teaching. So I can tell you that I'm not talking about co-teaching where there's two teachers all day long or all period for the entire core class across an entire grade. Really the original intention of co-teaching was to be that way, where it's two teachers, a regular educator and a specialist or a special educator working together all day long, right, or working in that core curriculum all day. But in most districts, and including mine, that we don't have the capacity to do that. We can't afford to have two teachers doing that all day long per grade. So it tends to look like your regular educator teaching the core and the special educator becoming an assist. Well, there is a pretty massive study that came out in 2012 regarding co-teaching with that model. I'm not talking about the really strong model of two teachers together, but this more teacher and assist type model, as well as a recent study that came out of Massachusetts showing that co-teaching has not demonstrated any improvement in ELA and math scores. So it's not demonstrating that we are actually getting the biggest bang for our buck. We're not getting that improvement in those scores, and you're much better off providing highly individualized and specialized instruction. Now, as the kids get older into middle and high school, it looks a little bit different. I've had major concerns for years. I'm a big supporter of least restrictive environment, which is access to the regular curriculum. I'm a big supporter of students being out there as much as possible, but we also have to realize that when we do that, we also are losing out on the opportunity to teach an individual foundational skill. They're not getting that foundational instruction when they're sitting in a class and you're helping them with the regular curriculum. So when we're helping them with the regular curriculum, which often happens in high schools, right? And it started in high schools, you're just helping them get through all the content, but not necessarily concentrating on the area of focus that student struggles with. So we're not necessarily improving that foundational skill. So for years I've seen that. And then I started creeping down into the middle school. My term for this, which, take it as you will, I call it limping through the curriculum. We're limping them through the curriculum. We're just trying to get them through. We're trying to get them through. Oh, more's coming. Get them through. And then that has happened in middle school. And then I've been very alarmed in the last year and a half when I realized that I started creeping it down into 5th and 4th grade. That 4th and 5th grade special educators are spending a lot of their time getting the kids through the core curriculum, but they're not working on remediating or strengthening or pre-teaching those foundational skills. Consider the elimination, at least a start, of co-teaching in those early grades minimally, especially K to 5. Think about whether or not you can provide much more intense specialized instruction that works on those foundational skills in a systematic way when it really counts. We know that reading, once you hit 9, it's much harder to learn, to be very fluent, and that's our time. We need to, birth to 9, to really hammer in and get those those language and those reading skills in. And here's my other big consideration. We did say future of education, right? Future of education, I would highly recommend, and I've probably been saying this for 17 years now, that we look at whether or not we should eliminate grade levels the way that we talk about them now. Grade levels categorize kids immediately, and the issue with it isn't the name of the grade level, grade 1, grade 2, whatever. It's more the fact that they have foundational skills, they're meeting standards, and I'm a big supporter of Common Core standards. I like the idea of standards. However, we're in kindergarten, I don't get these standards. I move on to first grade. First grade builds on kindergarten. I still don't have these standards. So then I'm moving on to first grade. Well, I don't get all the standards for KM1, and now I'm moved on to second grade. And by third grade, we have created what I call a faux disability. It's not really a disability. It's not really a processing issue with, and again, not all students, by the way. I'm just talking about some. It's not really a processing issue. It's not really a brain issue. It's more the fact that we've created these huge skill gaps because kids have not mastered the content before they move on. If we thought about grade level as being more of a fluidity, which means you kind of have to get rid of it because people would be like, oh, what are they, K1? That's the first question we ask kids, what grade are you in, right? And if we think more about fluidity of grades, and we think about, geez, if you're great in math, why am I keeping you at this level? You can keep working on those next standards. If you need more support in reading, we can give you more support in reading. You don't have to be on any particular grade level. You're more in a process within a standard. I think of this as modular learning. I think there's better terms for it, but that's how I think of it. As I get through a module, I move on to the next when I have mastery, and that's it. So that's something to consider too. I think it's an equalizer in that you could be gifted in the subject area or need support in the gifted in an area, and it wouldn't matter. It only matters because we're calling it a certain grade. So that's something to think about. I don't know how to do that, so don't ask me that, but I think it's something we really, really need to consider.
So Rachel, I'm looking at the time and thinking we need to wrap up here. I want to just make one comment, and then I'm going to ask Anne a question, okay? I think we've had some brilliant recommendations, not only for what we can do now, but for the future. If you think about equity consciousness and also all of Rachel's recommendations. I mean, Rachel, I was thinking about accommodations, and you have so many ideas there that can be used as accommodations for students with disabilities and for other students who are struggling, who need supports. So I hope you all will get a chance to really look over that list more carefully. So Anne, the question for you, which is kind of a follow-up to what Rachel was just saying, is that if you look at those reflections and you think about advocacy and advocating for students who have the highest needs, for our most vulnerable students, what do you think? What do you think could be done? How could we improve the advocacy and the outcomes for our most vulnerable students if we implemented some of what Rachel has suggested?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Rachel for the perspective that she has shared, because there was much in what she presented that is applicable across both special education and general education, and also relates back to what Yvette was talking about in terms of you want to take a look at what are those children's strengths, what are their passions, what are those areas that you can build upon and be creative in looking at how to help them to develop those foundational skills that are important. To your question, I would say that while there are many of those recommendations that I think can be applicable for some of our most vulnerable students, I would suggest that there were some areas where I might see things a little bit differently. So in terms of taking a look at how parents might be able to support their children in distance learning, some of those recommendations will work for many parents, but they will not work for all parents. And so, for example, it may be very difficult to find a place where the child can take their distance learning lesson quietly. That is assuming that they do have high-speed bandwidth, that they do have working devices. We'll just assume that for now. And there also is a challenge if you have more than one child and you're trying to educate them and make sure that they are connected to the distance learning. And one thing that I did hear Rachel say that I really I made myself a note, is that parents are not educators. And if that is relevant anywhere in particular, it is with special education, which requires a special certification. And so you can be a general ed teacher, but you have to go a next level in order to be able to be certified as a special education teacher. And I feel that it's important for us to understand that the way the system is designed, it does not lend itself to educators being able to design the individualized teaching strategies that have been promoted by both of my colleague panelists here today. And this, looking at Rachel's piece about you just want to pass them along and make sure that they can, well, the terminology that surfaced some time ago when we were really taking a look at the impact Common Core is that now you're teaching to the test, but you're not necessarily developing those skills in those students.
Thank you, Anne. I think you make some really valid points. And I wish we had like 3 more hours just to talk about what do we do given the discrepancies, given that, in fact, you know, as educators, we could look at one thing and do one set of implementation. But when we think about families and equity concerns, there's another layer that we need to look at. And our problem solving needs to look at these components together. So let's go on now to your presentation, Anne.
Well, thank you. There was also something that Rachel started out her presentation with that just resonated with me. And as you look at my slide, so Rachel said that she was looking for ways to educate all of our children. And so this is my introductory slide. For those that may be familiar with one of the soap operas that I heard about, never really got a chance to watch. But it used to say all our children. And what we're talking about here, it used to say all my children. And what we're talking about is how do we educate all of our children? And that's a charge for us to keep. How do we come about having that charge? It's because there is a public special education law in America. And I just want to highlight what our public special education, how did we get there? And what is it all about? The why, the when, the who, the what, and the where of special education in America. I'm going to give you just a brief history of my objectives for the few minutes that I have before you today. Brief history of the public school system and special education. When you leave here, I want you to have a good understanding of free and appropriate public education, what it is and what it isn't. And I want us to focus on equity as it relates to the outcomes for children who have been identified as having disabilities, who are Black and from low-income communities. And I want us to take that look as it leads us into a discussion about principles of equity and inclusion in the school setting. So real quick, a little history. In the 1890s, up through 1919, 1920, students with special needs were not even educated. They were not even considered to be eligible to attend public education and schools. And so there were even some opinions, legal opinions, that relegated students to not being educated at all. Luckily, through the work of parents, and I dare say advocates and attorneys, there were a series of legal opinions, court cases that changed that. And so we want to take a look at in 1972, there were two key cases. One was the Park decision, which was the Pennsylvania Association for, we don't use this term now, but retarded citizens. And this was the first right to education lawsuit in the country. And it opened Pennsylvania public schools to all retarded children, and in so doing changed how we look at education for students who were unfairly excluded from the benefits of a public education. The second case, which also occurred in 1972, was the Mills class action lawsuit. And in that case, it was a class action brought on behalf of 7 school children who had been denied placement in a public education program for substantial periods of time because of alleged mental, behavioral, physical, or emotional disabilities. And I want to just repeat that. Because of alleged mental, behavioral, physical, or emotional disabilities. And this was brought against the District of Columbia public school system, and that was also in 1972. These cases are important because they were the precursor to what we have today, which is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, which was addressed by Rachel. And so it was first passed as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, and that was in 1975. And then we had the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is what we have now. And that provides for a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And it mandates, and this is federal law, and it mandates parent participation. So this is really, really key. And so when we think about what FAPE requires, it requires a school to provide special education to meet the unique needs of the child. This is important, unique needs. The only way you can know that is that you are taking a look at the individual student. It also provides that there may need to be related services, things like speech therapy, counseling, and even transportation that are necessary for that child to be able to benefit from the education experience. These services have to be provided at no charge to the family member, no charge to them, because this is part of public education. And that we need to provide accommodations and modifications to help that child to learn and participate in the general education curriculum. I would say at this point that the key pieces to making sure that all of those provisions are met is the creation of an individualized education program. We call it an IEP, or individualized education plan, an IEP for that child. It's a written plan. It is very detailed, it should be, in terms of what that child's needs are, what are the supports that need to be put in place to help them to benefit from the education curriculum. So it's going to be important for you to be able to identify what the FAPE is. So I would like to have us ask that question. You want to make sure that you are following that. I would then like to take us to another little explanation around the importance of the individualized education plan. So we can move on. And when we look at all of our children and the charge that we have to keep under IDEA, there are a lot of different players in that. There's the parents, children, teachers, paraprofessionals, school and district administrators, advocates, attorneys, state departments of education. And even though that is a pretty long list, I'm wondering if there are any others who are key players in this process that we may not have identified. And so we'll be thinking about that as we go through my presentation. I'm going to want to come back to it. What I'd like to do is to focus on the children, key players in the process. And so if we're looking at an individualized education plan, we need to be looking at that child. We need to be identifying what their gifts are, what their challenges are, what are the supports that they need. And so sometimes what we end up with is we are looking at an incomplete picture of our children. And that's whether they are being looked at in the special education setting or the general education setting. And so when we look at it, we want to think about what are all of the different factors that contribute to this student's success. So if we could take a look at a student that I will call Miss Unique, what we want to look at here is what are some of those factors that make Miss Unique unique? Learning preferences, temperaments, culture. I would like to say that again, culture, because it was a key element of the presentation that was first delivered by Yvette. And it was very, very, and remains very important. Coping abilities. And I would say that if ever there was a time when coping abilities of our children was something that we need to really focus on, it would be during this pandemic. Home life, well, another factor, one that I alluded to when I talked about, well, what do we do if there are multiple students in this home and the parent is now expected to be able to support both of them? What happens if they are at different schools? Because we've seen that in some of our work. Community. Community is not always looked at as a key stakeholder in the education process, but it should be. Intellectual, social, and emotional abilities. And we are hearing a lot these days about SEL, social emotional learning. This is another area of, I think, opportunity that comes out of the pandemic and that crisis. But we need to be careful about how we are defining that, implementing it, and for whom. Because the reality is that we are in a time when it's not only your students who need to be provided with social emotional learning and supports, but every other key player in the educational process. Educators are parents, educators are family members, educators are going through the same kinds of experiences that the parents of their students are. So we need to take care of them. We need to make sure that we're looking at our systems and how we're supporting building staff, those who are called upon to be doing deep cleaning and are responsible for making sure that you're doing frequent wipe downs and all of the other different physical changes to the learning environment when we're in the learning environment that have to be made. Early childhood experiences. This would be a topic that I would be willing to come back and talk about. I'm sure that most of you may have been made aware of adverse childhood experiences studies that were done. But what we're seeing now is an unprecedented combining of factors that are impacting on our kids in ways that I don't think any of us could have ever thought about. But in terms of looking at how children are experiencing this pandemic, one of the things that I like to point out is that, for those of us that have been around for a while, for those of us who have already lived through some challenges in our lives, we have developed some natural coping skills. We have developed some level of resilience. And even with that, adults are being severely stressed by the anxiety, the uncertainty that we are experiencing with this pandemic. And that plays out in many different ways in the home. So it's really important for us to be thinking about that, because the children are going to internalize what they see from their family members, from their caregivers, from their educators. So the adults and how they are dealing with the pandemic has an impact on our children. So just think about it. If our adults are struggling with anxiety and depression, then our youth are as well.
Oh, Anne, I'm looking at the time, and I know we want to get to the word cloud, and we want to leave a few minutes for questions. Can you quickly kind of wrap up the next couple points so that we can make sure people have a chance to participate in that word cloud and a Q&A?
Absolutely. So
Thank
let
you.
us move then to, we can move to that word cloud, because of the things that I've gone through, I'm kind of want to have an idea from you all what might be missing, what factors have not been identified. And so from the listing of key players, who was missing? Providers, state departments of mental health, healthcare. These are all key players, and we're starting to see a lot more discussion between school districts and community providers to find out how they can support our students. Seeing a few things coming up in the chat as well. Community elders, pay sources, preventionists. Thank you all for doing that. Want to talk a little bit quickly about disparities across child and family serving systems, because even as we looked at Miss Unique, much of what was there was social determinants. And we hear a lot about social determinants. Primarily, we heard about them in the context of the healthcare setting, social determinants of health. But there are social determinants within each system: child welfare, juvenile justice, the adult justice system. And I would have to say, we know that there are social determinants in the education system as well. We want to be able to have a little bit of a conversation later on about when we're looking at equity, we have to be looking at some of the impacts of these disparities and how they play out in the education setting. One way that they play out is around school discipline, and especially when we take a look at exclusionary discipline. And there was something that was mentioned early on about, are we looking at restorative justice practices? Are we looking at our policies? So we have, in looking at school discipline, we know we have data, and this data comes from the U.S. Department of Education, and you can take a look at it also, I believe, on the WestEd site. There was a recent presentation that really went into these data. But Black students' suspension rate is nearly 4 times that for white students. Latinx students' suspension rate is 2.5 times that for white students. And students of color who are identified with disabilities face exclusionary discipline at much higher rates than their peers without disabilities. And so if we are to be looking at equity and what we can do to promote equity and foster that within our education system, I'd like us to once again take a look at the key players in that process. They are all important and they are all necessary. Parents, children, teachers, paraprofessionals, school and district administrators, advocates, attorneys, state departments of education. And if I can just relate to some of the comments from my other panelists, they talked about making sure that we can amplify student voice, making sure that we can have family engagement that's authentic and robust, Those are just some of the things that we know we need to do. And so these are key players in the process that we need to make sure that we are making room for. Also important are community members, which we do not have a lot of participation from, but they're part of the solution. And so I would just at this point, thank you for that opportunity to share what I've been able to present this afternoon. But the question that I leave us with as we look more closely at the key providers, key players, and social determinants are, what must we do to foster equity in our education system? What stands out from our social determinants of health, and what Miss Unique has shown us? Thank you.
And thank you so much. And thanks to all the panel. Equity is a huge concern, and we can only hope that it remains a huge concern and that we address it. It is so critical for our future, not only for education, but for the world. Let's go quickly and just wrap this up, and then we'll invite people to stay, and we'll be around for the next 10, 15 minutes if you'd like to stay and ask questions. So Dana, do you have some closing comments?
Yes, thanks, Chris. So thank you again, everyone, for joining today's webinar. A reminder that our funding does come from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which requires us to evaluate our services. So attendees that provided their email address will receive an evaluation survey 24 hours after the close of today's event, along with today's slide presentation. The follow-up email will include links to request CEU credits and/or a participation certificate. We appreciate your honest, anonymous feedback, which will provide information to SAMHSA and assist us in planning future meetings and programs. Your feedback really does count. We hope that you make plans to participate in upcoming online activities presented as a part of the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative. We will be announcing some of those opportunities for the 2021 year, so please do come to the New England MHTTC website to stay informed. For more information, contact the Center for Educational Improvement at info@edimprovement.org, or email Dr. Martha Staley, the director of the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.